dealing with the scribes and the Pharisees. The battles have already started. We're only in chapter 3. Actually, they started in chapter 1. But we're just in chapter 3, and we've already seen 4 or 5 conflicts or confrontations that have taken place. And so we find here at this point now, or Jesus, Mark includes right here where Jesus chooses his 12 apostles, those 12 disciples that are going to be closer to him and following him. And so here in chapter 3 and verse 14, it says, "And he appointed 12 so that they would be with him and that he could send them out to preach and to have authority to cast out demons." Okay, so I mentioned last week, I said there are 3 reasons why we see right here of why Jesus selected these 12 men. And that was kind of, I said, it's your homework. Can you find the 3 reasons that Jesus selected these 3 men? What are the 3 reasons that we find here in the text for why Jesus selected these men? What's reason number 1? What's that? Okay, so number 1, so that they would be with him. So to begin with, just in being with Jesus, this is so Jesus is going to be able to train them. He's going to have them closer to them, to him. They're going to be with him every day. They're going to learn from him, watch him. They're going to learn to model their, not just what they do, but how they think. By what they see in Jesus. Now, there were multitudes of disciples that were following Jesus all over the place. But these 12 are going to be privileged to be close to him all the time. And so they're going to learn a little bit more. He's going to focus more on this. So it shouldn't be a surprise then later on when Jesus is who do people say that I am? And they give all these different, well, they say that you're Elijah, and they say that you're the prophet, and they say that you're John the Baptist come back from the dead. They give all these. Those were probably a lot of even the other disciples that were following after Jesus that they just hadn't quite made the connections yet. But then Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And that's when Peter makes his great confession, "You are the Christ." That makes sense. They're closer to Jesus. They see everything about Jesus. And so those are some distinctions that are going to be made. And so, okay, that's reason number 1, so that they could be with him. What's reason number 2? Okay, so he could send them out to preach. And I just mark here in the text our number 1 and I had number 2. There's number 2. So I can kind of walk through the text when I'm going back through it and see where each one of these things are. Now, this is the whole reason why Jesus came. Mark 1:38. He says, let's go into other cities so that I may preach. That is what I was sent to do. And so now he's passing that on to those a few other men around him to be able to take the same message and to be able to preach as well. Okay, and number 3. Okay, to have authority to cast out demons. The word authority here is really the key word. That we've already seen the authority of Jesus a couple of times. You go back to chapter 1 and verse 22. It was in his teaching that they were amazed at his authority. We see in chapter 2 and verse 10 that when he healed the paralytic man, they were amazed, they were astonished at the power that he has, the authority that he had to do this. And really, there in chapter 2 and verse 10, Jesus, that was when he told the scribes and the Pharisees, he said, is it easier to say your sins are forgiven or to tell this man to pick up his pallet and walk? And he says, I am going to heal this man so that you can see that I have the authority to forgive sins. And so Jesus is constantly showing his authority. Now he's passing some of that authority on to the apostles. And so we'll see that as we continue through the gospel. So then in verse 16, we see the list, Mark's list of the 12 that were chosen. Verse 16, and I did want to make a mention too as well about authority. Authority is something that you don't just get. Authority is something that must be given to you. The police have authority because the law gives that authority to them. There's something that gives that authority. There are a lot of people who think they have authority, and they try to take authority for themselves, but that's never true authority. There has to be someone in authority to give you authority in order for it to be legitimate. And so that's what we see with Jesus. Jesus is proving his authority. And so now, when he passes that authority on to others, now their authority will have credibility because of who they got their authority from. And so that's going to be important as we continue through the gospel. All right, now in verse 16. It says, "And he appointed the 12, Simon, whom he gave the name Peter, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James. To them he gave the name," I've pronounced this so many different ways. It's actually a Aramaic word. Boanerges is probably the closest way to say that, which means sons of thunder. We don't know exactly why Jesus named them sons of thunder. We do know that they are men, that James and John, they are very independent. They pursue importance. We'll see James and John asking Jesus, is it possible for us to sit at your right hand, for us to be the most important people in the kingdom? When it gets there, even their mother is going to approach Jesus and ask them, can my sons be the most important ones for you in the kingdom? But there is one example in Luke 9 and verse 54. There in Luke 9, Jesus and his apostles are traveling through Samaria, and they stop at a point to ask some Samaritans for help, basically to help put them up for the night, and just for hospitality for the night. And the Samaritans refuse. When they learn that they are headed to Jerusalem for a Jewish feast, the Samaritans refuse, because the Samaritans, to them, no, we don't worship. We're not going to support somebody worshiping in Jerusalem. We worship here. That's kind of their mentality. And so in Luke 9:54, James and John turn to Jesus and say, "Do you want us to call down fire from heaven on these people and destroy them?" I think that personality is probably something that we see in why Jesus named them sons of thunder. That they obviously had a strong personality. They jumped to, well, let's just kill them all then, and so Jesus had to deal with that in training them and working with them to be who he needed them to be. Verse 18 says, "And Andrew," these are all ones we've already seen so far: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. We've also seen Levi or Matthew. It says, "And Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him." So Jesus, it mentions here that he chose who he wanted. It's who he wanted to be. This wasn't just and I think that's significant when we see who he picks. Because here you have someone who is a zealot. What is a zealot? Yeah. These are, and you might make a note here, these are the anti-Roman Jews. Now, all Jews are anti-Roman, but these are the extremists. These are the guys that would when there's crowds of multitudes of people together, they would sneak up behind a Roman soldier. And a Roman soldier, their armor did not typically cover their back. And these zealots knew that. And so they would hide a knife. The knife that they carried was called a Sicarii, and sometimes they became known as the Sicarii warriors. But they were they were actually very, very cowardly people, because they would walk up behind them, they would pull these knives out, stab a Roman soldier in the back, hide the knife, and kind of mingle their way through the crowd as that Roman soldier fell and died. And they would do all kinds of things to oppose Rome. They hated Rome. And so Jesus chooses one of these guys to be one of his apostles. And so it's interesting to see the choices that Jesus makes. Why would Jesus pick men who would cause even more of a challenge for him to connect with the trust of the Jews? Here's someone that is even the Jew. Most of the Jewish people didn't like the Zealots. So why would Jesus pick people like this? Okay. Okay. A lot of times we see the personalities in people and we fight against their personalities. We'll see someone who, and sometimes in our children, if our children are not like us, a lot of times we try to mold them to be more like us. And it's like the mother or when she was a little girl growing up, and she wanted the little girl wanted to be out in plays in school and out in front of people and sing in the choir and be out in front of everybody. And her mother was very quiet, very reserved. She'd stay home. She liked to read books and just not be out in the limelight. And so she would always tell her daughter, you're just being selfish. You're too prideful. You're too arrogant, wanting to be out in front of people like that. And you don't need to be like, because she was different than her. And then when this little girl grew up to be a mother, her daughter ended up being like her grandmother. Her daughter would rather sit in a corner and read a book or just be quiet. And so this mom tried to force her daughter now out. You need to get out and be in front of people, and you need to be out and let people see you do things and accomplish things. And that wasn't. And it was just kind of this tendency that if they're not like you, a lot of times we try to twist people to be like us. There's that guy that just drives you nuts because they talk all the time, or they whatever their personality is. And a lot of times we deprive those people from the things that they need the most, and instead of doing what Jesus does. Jesus takes their personalities and he molds them into what he needs them to be so that they can serve him in different ways. Look at Peter. Peter would not be the first guy on my list to pick to be a disciple of Jesus. Putting his foot in his mouth all the time, he just could not get things right. He was a mess. He would open his mouth up at the worst times possible. And so that kind of guy, a lot of times we look at people like Peter in society as just kind of a troublemaker. Would you just keep your mouth shut? Jesus needed him to not keep his mouth shut. Who was it that ended up being used on the day of Pentecost to stand up and proclaim the gospel for the first time? Jesus was able to take the personalities of people and mold them, and he had to do a lot of molding with the apostles, but he molded them and trained them to use their gifts and their personalities for good things. And so I think that's right. He has zeal. Here's a guy, a zealot. He has passion about something. Jesus needed some men with some passion. Now, not all of these 12 were real passionate guys, and we see that in various things throughout the Gospels. But I think that's another thing. But at the same time, Jesus has also picked Matthew. What did Matthew do? He was a tax collector. You've got a zealot who hates the Romans, and you've got a tax collector who works for the Romans, both now together working amongst the 12 apostles. And so You look at things like that, what message could this give to all of the multitudes of people that were following Jesus?
It's kind of the idea of not having a biasness towards, you got to see Christ for who he truly is, and not people who he surrounds himself by, what we perceive them to be, but to just go straight to Christ for that love and that following, and put away mother and father and all of our context of life that might keep us from following him.
Right. And that's in contrast to what the Pharisees were doing. Because Jesus is saying, I'm not going to label you and put you in a box like the Pharisees are trying to do. It doesn't matter what your past is. It doesn't matter what you've been. It's what you can become. And I think that's what Jesus shows by using such a wide variety, the sons of thunder, and men like Peter, and men like Matthew, and zealots that were there as well. And so this can also show that when things are done right according to the will of God, that people from the most distant walks of life can all fellowship together. Just look around the room right here this morning. How many different places and backgrounds and socioeconomic places and do we have sitting right here? But because of the will of God and the desire to obey the will of God, it draws everybody together into a fellowship that nobody else, no other group of people in the world can experience. And so it's an amazing thing that we see, and I think we see that example with what Jesus is doing here. Now the last one on the list is Judas. And it's Judas. It mentions that he's the one who's going to betray Jesus. Now, the Gospel of Mark was written after all of this happened, and so, they knew that this Judas by the time it was written. But also, the question comes up a lot of times. People, did Jesus know when he picked Judas that he was going to be the one who was going to betray him? That's an argument that a lot of people have that go back and forth. Well, maybe at the time he didn't realize, but later on he did. I personally believe that he did. We've seen already 2 times that Jesus is able to see into the hearts of men. And we do see later that Jesus knows that Judas is the one who's going to betray him. And so, but what's interesting is even with all that, Jesus still gave him the same authority. And Jesus still let him manage the money. We see the money bag that they carried. Judas was the one in charge of that. Jesus didn't seem to treat Judas any differently than any of the others. But, yes, sir. That's true. Right. Right. And we do know some about the personality of Judas. We know he was greedy. So we can kind of make assumptions off of what we do know about him. That as Jesus began to continue in his ministry and Judas began to realize that, okay, I thought I've become convinced that this is the Messiah. I thought he was going to be this king, like the Jews had thought the Messiah was going to be, a king that was going to reign and rule and sit on a throne and destroy all of their enemies and as the Jews thought, and how much wealth and power would that bring? Judas was a part of the 12 when they were arguing back and forth about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And maybe when he began to realize that, man, what Jesus is teaching isn't leading this way. Why is he not taking the power? We're not looking at John, but in John chapter 6, the people were ready to anoint Jesus king. They're ready to make him king. And Jesus didn't want it. And those types of things, you wonder, did that influence someone like Judas with the way he thought and the things in his head and his mind? and to ultimately say, fine, if Jesus isn't going to be the king that I thought he was, then I'll help these Jews get rid of him. And so we don't know exactly what was going on in Judas' mind, but we do know a lot more about him that can kind of help us lead. But I think that's right. Maybe at this time, he didn't have that mindset. The question is, though, did Jesus still know that it would eventually lead to that or not? We don't know. The text doesn't tell us. And so we can't really speculate on that. But another issue that comes up a lot here is, was Judas predestined to betray Jesus? Did Judas not even have a choice? It was prophesied that Jesus would be betrayed by one of those that were closest to him. It's not predestined. And what happens a lot of times is people try to equate the foreknowledge of God with the predestination of God. And they're two totally different things. If I were to climb up on a bridge, does God know whether or not I'm going to jump off that bridge or not? Yes, he does. Does he make me jump off that bridge? No, he does not. He leaves it up to my choice. But he knows what's going to happen. And and that's the way that God has worked all through time. And there have been some things that we've seen throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament where God would help direct and place people in specific places so that his plan would unfold the way that it needed to. God was going to make sure that that happened. But when it comes to something like this, it's not that God, when Judas was born, that you are just determined. I'm going to make you the person that's going to betray my son when he comes. It's not the way that God did it. It's not the way it worked. There's nothing in the text that states that God had anything to do like that. But he allowed the decisions of Judas to make that decision, and God knew it was going to happen. Doesn't mean that he made it happen. And so it's two totally different things there. We got to be really careful with how we judge God on things like that. So he's picked the 12. Verse 20 says, kind of starting a new thought here, and he came home, and the crowd gathered again to such an extent that they could not even eat a meal. Where is home? In the context of what we've seen so far, and where Jesus is going to be spending a lot of time, where is home considered in the Gospel of Mark for Jesus? It's in Galilee, but we see Capernaum as being that central location that is where Jesus has been. And now it could be referring that he's returning to Nazareth. Nazareth was not very far away, and that was his hometown. But what we see take place with Jesus is Capernaum becomes his home and becomes kind of his central place that he works out of throughout the rest of his ministry. But this also shows just how the masses of people continue to invade the life and the work of Jesus. Notice how it describes it. That the crowd had gathered again to such an extent that they could not even eat a meal. They couldn't even eat a meal in their own home because of the masses of people. And it makes sense. Hey, we heard of a guy who can heal you. And the people from all over, we saw just a few verses before, there are people coming from Tyre and Sidon and all over the place because of what they're hearing that Jesus is doing. And so I would be the same way. If I had somebody in my family who was a paralytic or had some terrible disease or something like that, and I knew there's no hope, but now I've heard there is hope, I'd be knocking a guy's door down too. And so it makes sense what people are doing, but it just shows how pervasive this has become in the life of Jesus. Verse 21, it says, when his own people heard of this, they went out to take custody of him, for they were saying he has lost his senses. His own people, it says his own people. Who are his own people? Who's that referring to? What's that? Okay. Look down in the text a little bit. Drop down to verse 31. As you see in verse 31, it says, then his mother and his brothers arrived. It's kind of bookends there. His people are coming. From verse 22 through 29, there's this discussion that Jesus has with the scribes. But this kind of bookends that are there in verses 21 and 31 of who his people were. And so we see that his family is going to be involved in who that is talking about. It says, they came to take custody of him, for they were saying he has lost his senses. So Jesus' own family, people that are close to him, these are the people who grew up with him. And they have heard what he's saying about himself and the things that he's doing. This is Jesus. It's going to be a little bit later that some of the people in his hometown are going to say, is this not the son of Joseph, the carpenter's son? We know this kid. And they just could not believe what they were hearing and what Jesus was claiming. And so here we see these people I've never stopped to think about it. Have you ever stopped to think about how what Jesus was doing, how it was impacting the rest of his family? If the scribes and the Pharisees they hate Jesus so much, this is something the text never says happens, but if they hate Jesus so much, do you think that the scribes and the Pharisees were probably also harassing his family? I think we see the scribes do that. The Pharisees do that with other people. The man that was blind that Jesus healed, what did they do? They went and got his mom and dad and brought them and said, tell us about your son. This was something that they were known to do. I can only imagine that the scribes and the Pharisees were putting pressure on Mary and on his brothers and all the family, probably trying to get them as well. Would you get him to be quiet? He's lost his mind. And maybe that's why some of this is happening. Again, the text doesn't say that, but I try to put yourself in the real world that they're living in. Is that something the Jews would have done? Absolutely, they would have. And so you can kind of maybe see some of the reasons why some of these other things are happening kind of behind the scenes. Verse 22 says, the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebul, and he casts out demons by the ruler of the demons. Where were these scribes from? Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't switched screens, have I? Sorry. They're from where? Jerusalem. I'm a little behind. Give me a second. Okay, they're from Jerusalem. Why are there now scribes from Jerusalem showing up? What does it seem like's happening here? Because there were scribes and Pharisees in Galilee, in Capernaum. They were already there. They were a part of the synagogues. They were a part of all that was there. That seems to be who Jesus has been dealing with so far. Now it specifically means scribes from Jerusalem have come. What it sounds like is probably all of these scribes from Capernaum, what they've done is they've called the main office and said, we've got a problem. We need some help. And word has spread. Jesus has done nothing in Jerusalem. So far in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has not done one single thing in Jerusalem. And so there's no reason that the scribes in Jerusalem would be upset or with him or anything. They haven't seen or heard anything. But somehow they learn about this and they are sent to check out what's going on with Jesus. And so they admit that he has the power to cast out demons. I think that is amazing. They admit that he has the power and the authority to cast out demons. But what they do is they claim that this is because he's possessed by Beelzebul. Now, Beelzebul, this is a term that's relates to Satan. And it's used in 2 Kings chapter 2 4 different times. It's used in 2 Kings chapter 2. And it's in connection to what is Beelzebul? What does that sound like? It's somewhat connected to something you read about in the Old Testament a lot. Baal. Baal, and that's exactly what this is. They are saying that he is a servant of Baal. Beelzebul was a term that was literally referring to what they would call the Lord of the Flies. And this was a false god that many of the pagan nations that they believed in, and this was the god that had the ability to give and to take away and heal diseases. And so here Jesus is taking away diseases. He's casting out demons and he's healing people. And so you remember what the Pharisees are trying to do. Back in verse 6, what are they trying to do? They got together with the Herodians and they were conspiring to figure out a way, we've got to figure out a way to destroy Jesus. Well, this is the tactic, this is the method they chose to go with. We're seeing it now. They finally have decided, well, we could connect him and what he's doing with Baal and with the false god, the god of Satan. And we're going to be able to get him on this. People are going to see this and, oh, he's healing. Boy, they might be right. If he's able to take away diseases, that's what that god of Baal was able to do. And so you see the tactic that they're trying to use here. So in verse 23, says, and he called them to himself. Called who? Who's them? The scribes. He is now going to teach directly to the scribes. He doesn't do this very often. He always is teaching so that the scribes can hear, but very rarely does he talk directly to them unless he's answering their questions. And so he calls them to himself and begins speaking to them in parables. Note that he's speaking in parables. That's going to be significant. And he says, how can Satan cast out Satan? And so Jesus asks a very important question here. It doesn't make any sense for Satan to be doing something that's self-defeating. How can Satan cast out Satan? Why would he do that? And he goes on with this in verse 24. He says, if a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. If Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but he is finished. And so, which kingdom? He says, if kingdom is divided against itself, it cannot stand. What kingdom is he talking about in this context? Okay, he's talking about the kingdom of Satan. Remember, a kingdom is the reign and the power and the authority of someone. And so he's referring to, now he's using the illustration of the kingdom of Satan, of the demons. And even if their kingdom is divided against itself, it can't stand. It's going to fall apart. And so it's interesting here that Jesus uses by talking about the kingdom and the house. A kingdom and a house. Jesus is beginning to make a connection here. Kingdom is really an Old Testament term. Let's talk about God's plan for his kingdom. And of course, Jesus preaches the kingdom here as well. But when we get into the New Testament, you begin to see God using household terminology more. And so there's a connection that's made here. We're going to see this connection actually better when we get to chapter 11. But we see that there's a comparison being made between a kingdom and a house. Now, yep.
Mentioned this before, but Lincoln said, "A house divided itself cannot stand," and historians jump all over that like that it was original with Lincoln.
Right.
Well, it wasn't part of the original Lincoln. But in light of what you were just saying, if we look at a family divided itself, it's got problems.
Yep.
You look at a church that's divided on doctrinal issues will not stand.
Yep.
So it can have some very personal application to us.
Yep, absolutely. And that's something I think that Jesus is actually going to be getting into. The illustration, we're done with this illustration that he's using. He's going to conclude it in verse 27. We're going to finish in verse 27 next week and look at how Jesus concludes this. But it all comes back to who has authority and who doesn't. And, okay, here's your homework for next week. Somehow what is happening right here, what Jesus is going to be talking about right here in verse 27 is going to connect with something that happened in chapter 1. See if you can make that connection of what verse 27 talks about here and what happened back in chapter 1. And next Sunday, see if you can, I'll see who is piece that together to figure out what's going on.